Welcome to another episode of Witty CFB. Your host, Sheply here. And on today's episode, we got Kevin McGuffrey, the last word on sports contributor and also a Bilnikoff Award voter. Kevin, it's great to have you on. I've been following your work for a long time now, and I'm really excited to talk some Kentucky football with you. And obviously the big breaking news with Vince Marrow becoming the general manager of Louisville. So it's really excited to have you on.
Well, thank you, Rob. I really appreciate it, and thank you for the kind words. I really appreciate that too. So, yeah, there's absolutely nothing going on in the Kentucky football program the last week or so. Nothing's happened. Obviously, as you said, as the title suggests, Vince Marrow, who pretty much had been Mark Stoops' right-hand man ever since Stoops came to Kentucky. He's going on his 13th year now, and he just, last week there had been rumors. I mean, let's just throw it all out there. I mean, there's been rumors for a while that Marrow had been looking at other places. I mean, just this past year, his name came up with his name has come up with a couple head coaching searches in the MAC. I think Western Michigan might have been the most recent one. Then there was Bill Belichick, his staff at North Carolina. His name popped up there as a possible tight ends coach and a recruiting guru, as you may say, and then all those rumors kind of died down, and then there was back before Christmas, after the recruiting cycle ended, Vince was on a show here in Lexington, Kentucky Sports Radio. I'm sure everyone's heard of it. It's the biggest thing in Kentucky, and they just kind of asked him point blank. He said, "When the season starts, in August, will you be on the sidelines?" And there was this pause, and he was like, and he kind of paused. Then he was like, "Oh yeah, of course, I'll be here." And ever since then, everybody was like, "Okay, wait a minute." But then as you went into the recruiting and the transfer portal into the spring, you didn't really hear much from him. And all of a sudden, I said in the past week, this came out. I think it was Pete Thamel from ESPN who first reported it, that he was taking a job with U of L with, as the general manager, whatever the title is for it. And honestly, this is probably something that's been brewing for a while. He and Jeff Brom go way back to the early 2000s, going back to the XFL, the original XFL, for those that may remember, Matt, the one that Vince McMahon created and lasted, I think, a year or maybe two. He hate me. That was probably the biggest thing that came from the original XFL. But they played together, and I guess they've kind of have been friends ever since. And even going back to Brom's days at Purdue, he's tried to get Marrow to join his staff, and it's never happened until now. And then when he got to Louisville, it really started heating up, 2 years ago, and now we're to the point where we are. And now, to my knowledge, he's the first. I think somebody said there was maybe a women's basketball coach that went straight from Kentucky to Louisville back in the 1980s. Of course, Rick Pitino was the most famous example.
Right.
Coached Kentucky for 8 years, led them to a national championship, I think 3 or 4 Final Fours. Took a job with the Boston Celtics, but at least there was a buffer. He went to the Celtics for 4 years, and then came back and took the job at Louisville. And but yeah, to my knowledge, this is the first time we've had, in football especially, a direct line, literally up Interstate 64. It's 72 miles or something. So, but anyway, but yeah, that's where we are now, and now everyone's trying to adjust and move on with their lives, so to speak. So.
Yeah, because you brought up a great point too. This seems like it was just kind of the perfect storm of, hey, Vince Marrow probably knows in the back of his head that, hey, maybe his influence isn't really there as much too. We talked about this a little bit off camera about how obviously the NIL stuff is always going to be more prevalent, and obviously the recruiting model is going to be changing too. And then when you bring in other guys like Eddie Gran in the background and new assistants and things like that too, there's probably just other voices that Mark Stoops could be listening to more than Vince Marrow now. So with that said, it kind of makes me think to myself now too, now that Vince Marrow is moving on to Louisville, how do you see Kentucky's football, particularly evolving. I mean, particularly when it comes to recruiting.
Well, the interesting thing about this is that, and that I've talked about it, and others have talked about it. If you go, like, I've got 247 Sports called up right now. If you look up until today, before Marrow left, Kentucky only had one recruit in the 2026 class. He was a player from Paducah Tillman, which is a traditional Kentucky power. But if you go back and look at those great UK teams, Marrow built this pipeline from Ohio. He's a Youngstown guy, like Mark Stoops. From Ohio to Kentucky, you think about the Benny Snells and the Lynn Bowdens, and I could just, we could go on and on. Yeah. But all of those guys came from, were recruited by Marrow, came to Kentucky, and did great things. But if you look, like I said, there was one player committed, and they were like, they weren't even that many offers to kids in Ohio, and everybody was like, okay, what's going on here? Of course, now we know. But the funny thing is, since Marrow's announcement, Kentucky has added 5 players in the last week. So, so they went from, whether it's a coincidence, you make your own, you can draw your own conclusions, but again, none of those kids are from Ohio either. So they have, one from Paducah. They've got one from Ohio, or excuse me, from a safety, Messiah Tilson, who just committed today, actually, as we're recording this, just, this afternoon. And then they've got Florida, Texas, and Georgia. But yeah, the rumor, like I said, where everybody has their stories, what's true officially, but that Marrow had kind of lost the ear of Stoops on recruiting. And you mentioned Eddie Gran, who was the offensive coordinator here for years. He's kind of got like that, not necessarily a GM role, but he has, like, one of those, non-assistant coaching jobs, but where he kind of helps oversee the program. And that Gran had kind of gotten in Stoops here more about who they needed to pick and who they should go after. And of course, pride and everything else, this used to be my thing. And now, this other guy wants me to do his thing for him. And so that's kind of what's happened. And then to take a step further, over the last few years, Kentucky has dominated in-state recruiting here in Kentucky. But you look, I think the last I saw, it was like 5 of the top 8 players in Kentucky for this class, including, I think, an offensive lineman who just committed the other day, are all going to Louisville. So again, conspiracy theories, whatever. Does that mean, was Marrow secretly saying, hey, I'm going to Louisville, come with me? We don't know. That's as far as I want to speculate. But it does seem to be true that Marrow did not have the ear of Stoops like he had in these previous years, and I think that probably led in a big way to what we've seen happen over the last week. And then he put out a message on I think it was on, I still call it Twitter, but it was on X this morning, thanking Kentucky for their support over the last 13 years, and says that the decision wasn't easy, but he had to do it for the betterment of his career, and stuff like that. So and then he closed by saying, I know you guys are going to boo me when we play, but just know that I'm trying to read the exact quote, but I really do love you guys, or something like that. So
yeah, but anyway, it's not like he owes him anything. I mean, at the same time, I mean, he did his 12 seasons with them, and he brought a lot to Kentucky in terms of recruiting. You mentioned a bunch of guys like the Lee Bowdens of the world, the Benny Snells, et cetera, et cetera. And with that said too, I guess the other jumping off point we can mention real quick too is, I guess you can kind of argue there's a little bit of foreshadowing in this, right, too, because obviously there's 29 new transfers that are coming in, and not to mention too, this is pretty much a complete new coaching staff aside from Brad White, who's their defensive coordinator, and Bush Hamden, who's their offensive coordinator for now year 2. I think it's like the first time since like 2020 that they've had the same offensive coordinator. But even if you go down and look at that staff too, a lot of these guys are first time with Kentucky too. I even saw Brad Lambert on there, who was defensive coordinator at Wake Forest too. So they're bringing in some solid names to be assistants and whatnot too. So yeah, I guess you can also kind of argue that they're kind of evolving in that way too.
Right. And as you said, as you brought up the offensive coordinator, the one who was here was Eddie Gran, and for like I think 5 years, and then you had after Gran retired, got whatever the choice of term, you had Liam Cohen the first go around, and then you had oh gosh, I can't think of his name now. I'm drawing a blank now. He was that in 2022, and then you had Liam Cohen 2.0, and then you had Hamden last year. But I think last year was just a weird year. In Rich Gangarello is who I was trying to think of.
Yeah.
So he was one of those guys. Another one of those West Coast guys that came here, and it just didn't work. But then you get to the point: is it you think about some of the guys who've been here, you go back and look through all those coordinators. You got, you had Neil Brown, and then of course he obviously went to West Virginia, and went on to be a pretty successful coach. Shannon Dawson was one of the first offensive coordinators here, and of course now he was at Miami. And you see, but maybe having Cam Ward on your team has a lot to do with that.
Right.
But I do think a lot of Kentucky's struggles, especially in the last couple of years, the offensive line has just not been what it was. As we talked off the air, you go back and look at those Kentucky teams, the 10-win teams, the Citrus Bowl winners. It was all about the strong running game with the Boone Williamses and the Benny Snells and the Chris Rodriguez's, and then the year where basically they just lined up Lynn Bowden at quarterback and dared teams to stop them, and they couldn't do it. That was that 2019 season is still one of the most remarkable, the most remarkable things that I can remember in recent history. But it'll be interesting to see. As you said, there's a lot of young, newer guys on the staff, and I obviously a whole lot of turnover. And no one is. Let's be honest, no one, myself included, probably is not really expecting anything much out of Kentucky. One of the other things I do. For last word, I do some bowl projections. I just, it's something I've always thought was, interest, kind of fun and doing all this stuff. And so I do not have Kentucky. I have some first really early bowl projections that are going to come out this week. And no, I don't have Kentucky in there. But yeah, I mean, but the thing about it is, so a lot of people are trying to compare this to 2016, where no one expected anything out of Kentucky. Stoops went 2-10, 5-7, 5-7 those first 3 years, and even into the 2016 struggled to the point where he almost, where athletic director Mitch Barnhart almost, fired him, but he let him finish out the season, and they got hot, and they, made a bowl game, and then the program just, and let's be honest, Stoops taken the program to heights it's never seen, but the last couple of years have been, as high as that was, the last couple of years were kind of rough. So, but as you said, maybe we can have a year like 2016. There's always those teams that no one expects to do anything that all of a sudden comes out of nowhere, wins 7-8 games. Like it's one of the school's mottos. They're like, why not Kentucky? But I don't know. It's tough. If they were playing it somewhere other than this SEC, I might think they'd have a chance. But they have the 7th toughest schedule in football, I think, according to the ESPN, FPI or whatever you call it. So that the schedule is not doing them any favors, that's for sure.